The UFC once crowned Ronda Rousey as the baddest woman on the planet, a fighter who seemed untouchable. She was the golden child, the athlete who became a global star almost overnight. Hollywood turned her into an action hero. WWE made her into a spectacle, and the sports world hailed her as the face of a revolution. But beneath the bright lights and beyond the highlight reels was a truth the UFC never wanted fans to see. Ronda's fall wasn't just about devastating knockouts. It was about favoritism, mental breakdowns, and a carefully buried story that exposed how fragile her rise truly was. From the very beginning, Dana White and the UFC machine handpicked Ronda as their weapon to sell women's MMA to the mainstream. This was the same Dana White who, just a few years earlier, had sworn that women would never fight in the UFC. But then came Ronda, an Olympic medalist in judo, charismatic, dangerous, and marketable. She wasn't just another fighter, she was the perfect storm of talent and persona. And for Dana, she was the golden ticket. The UFC began shaping her image from day one. Her armbar became her calling card, a vicious weapon that ended fights in seconds. Her early victories were edited into highlight reels that made her look almost supernatural. The speed, the precision, the sheer brutality. Fans were hooked before they even had time to process what happened. She wasn't just winning, she was annihilating. And the UFC spun that dominance into a legend. Dana White called her the greatest female athlete of all time before she had even defended her belt. The hype machine was already in overdrive, but what most fans didn't realize was how carefully this myth was engineered. Every fight was handpicked to showcase her strengths. Critics pointed out that fighters like Chris Cyborg, who posed legitimate threats, were kept at arm's length. Instead, Ronda fought opponents who were tailor-made to crumble against her grappling dominance. The UFC wasn't just building a champion, they were building a myth. And that myth was worth millions. Pay-per-views skyrocketed, arenas filled, and Ronda Rousey's face was everywhere. Magazines, late-night talk shows, red carpets, even blockbuster movies. She wasn't just a fighter anymore, she was a brand. But a myth, no matter how powerful, is fragile. And once cracks begin to show, there's no repairing them. The truth the UFC never wanted fans to see was just how much favoritism Ronda received behind the curtain. Media obligations that were grueling for other fighters were optional for her. While fighters like Miesha Tate were dragged through endless press tours, Ronda was given leeway. If she stormed out of an interview, UFC spun it as passion. If another fighter did the same, they were reprimanded or fined. Dana White defended her at every turn, portraying her as untouchable not only inside the cage, but outside of it as well. And then there was the money. While women before her had to scrape for scraps, Ronda was banking millions. Some of it was deserved. She was a draw like no one else in the sport. But the favoritism created resentment. Behind the scenes, fighters whispered that her opponents were softer matchups, that her marketing was rigged, that the UFC was protecting their golden goose at all costs. She wasn't just another fighter, she was the chosen one, and everyone knew it. But favoritism comes at a cost. It isolates you. It shields you from the criticism and lessons that could make you better. Instead of evolving her striking or shoring up weaknesses, Ronda doubled down on what worked in the past. Her coach, Edmond Tarverdian, was notorious for feeding her false confidence, telling her she was a world-class boxer when her striking defense was practically non-existent. Surrounded by yes-men and protected by the UFC, she stopped growing as a fighter. And when you stop evolving in MMA, the fall is inevitable. The collapse came in November 2015 in Melbourne, Australia, when Ronda faced Holly Holm, On paper, it was supposed to be another coronation. UFC 193 was marketed as the biggest event of her career. Commercials painted her as unstoppable, a once-in-a-lifetime force. But Holm, calm and calculated, had been studying Ronda for years. She exposed every weakness that had been ignored. While Ronda rushed forward recklessly, Holm countered with sharp, punishing strikes. The aura of invincibility evaporated in real time. Then came the head kick, a thunderous strike that sent Ronda crashing to the canvas. Unconscious, her myth shattered in front of the world. That loss wasn't just a defeat. It was the end of the illusion. Fans saw the head kick, but they didn't see what happened afterward. They didn't see the broken woman hiding from the world, nursing wounds that went deeper than bruises and concussions. Months later, in a rare moment of vulnerability, Ronda appeared on The Ellen DeGeneres Show and admitted that after the Holm fight, she sat in the hospital and thought about suicide. Her words were raw, shocking, and heartbreaking. "I was literally sitting there and thinking about killing myself," she confessed, holding back tears. For the first time, the superhero mask cracked. The baddest woman on the planet revealed she was deeply human and deeply broken. But the UFC didn't know what to do with that truth. Dana White made no major public statement about mental health. There were no campaigns, no visible support systems. Instead, the machine pressed forward, pretending the myth could still be salvaged. They wanted fans to keep believing in the unbreakable Ronda, because to admit her vulnerability was to admit that the entire narrative they had built was a lie. Her depression went deeper than one loss. She had carried trauma since childhood. When she was just 8 years old, her father committed suicide, a tragedy that left a scar she carried into adulthood. She grew up hardened by pain, but haunted by it as well. Fighting became her outlet, her shield against the grief. But when Holm destroyed her in Melbourne, all of that trauma resurfaced. It wasn't just about losing a fight. It was about losing the identity she had built to survive. But the UFC didn't want that story told. Instead of letting her speak openly, they allowed her to vanish. Other fighters, when defeated, were dragged in front of cameras, forced to face reporters, to explain themselves. Ronda was allowed to disappear. She skipped press conferences, refused interviews, and remained silent for months. And the UFC let it happen. For anyone else, it would have been unacceptable. For Ronda, it was orchestrated image control. When she did return, it was treated like a redemption story. At UFC 207 in December 2016, she was booked against Amanda Nunes. The UFC promoted it as Ronda's grand comeback, splashing her face across posters and commercials, while Nunes, the reigning champion, was barely mentioned. But the reality couldn't have been more brutal. From the opening bell, Nunes dismantled her with ease. Shot after shot landed clean. Ronda had no answers, no adjustments. In just 48 seconds, it was over. Ronda hadn't thrown a single meaningful strike. The once untouchable queen looked helpless. The UFC's investment collapsed on live television. After that, the silence returned. Dana White didn't push her for another fight. The UFC stopped mentioning her alongside legends. They didn't celebrate her contributions or give her a proper farewell. They just moved on. For all the money she had made them, for all the barriers she had broken, Ronda Rousey became a ghost in UFC history. After UFC 207, Ronda Rousey vanished. There was no farewell fight, no retirement press conference, not even a statement from Dana White acknowledging her departure. For a fighter who had carried the company on her back, her exit was eerily quiet. The UFC machine that had once promoted her as invincible now pretended she didn't exist. It was as if she had been erased from the sport's history. Instead, Ronda resurfaced in a different world, professional wrestling. To many fans, her leap to WWE seemed bizarre. How could the most feared woman in MMA trade the cage for scripted entertainment? But in hindsight, it made sense. WWE gave her something the UFC couldn't anymore: control over the story. In wrestling, wins and losses are predetermined. Narratives are crafted. And for a woman who had been broken by the collapse of her myth, this was survival. In WWE, she thrived. She headlined WrestleMania, won championships, and became a spectacle once again. Crowds cheered as she reinvented herself in the squared circle. For fans who had once booed her UFC silence, this was a rebirth. But to critics in the fight world, her transition looked like an escape. To them, it seemed she had run from the cage the moment she could no longer dominate. The UFC's response only fueled this perception. They barely mentioned her. There were no constant replays of her highlights, no Hall of Fame induction, no celebrations of her pioneering role. Compare that to fighters like Georges St-Pierre or Anderson Silva, whose legacies were enshrined even after losses. Ronda was different. Her name became a ghost, whispered but rarely celebrated. This wasn't an accident. It was strategy. By not acknowledging her, the UFC avoided reminding fans of how spectacularly she had fallen. To talk about Ronda meant talking about Holmes' head kick, about Nunes's 48-second destruction, about the silence that followed. The UFC didn't want that narrative resurfacing, so they buried her legacy beneath new stars, minimizing her role in history to protect their own image. But here's the truth. Ronda Rousey's story wasn't just about hype and collapse. It was about pain, fragility, and the cost of being turned into a myth. Long before she was famous, tragedy defined her. Her father's suicide when she was only 8 years old scarred her forever. Growing up, she carried grief like a shadow. Fighting became her outlet, her armor against that wound. But trauma doesn't disappear. It lingers, waiting for cracks. When Holmes shattered her aura, the trauma resurfaced. The UFC never wanted fans to see this. Vulnerability doesn't sell pay-per-view. But it was real. Her struggles went beyond fighting. As a child, she battled speech issues that left her feeling isolated. She poured herself into judo, trained by her mother, Anne Maria de Mars, a world champion herself. She became tough, relentless, determined. But behind that toughness was still a child who had never healed from her father's death. Every fight was more than just competition. It was survival. And when she lost, the survival mechanism broke. That was the story the UFC buried. Her Hollywood career only deepened the split between image and reality. Roles in The Expendables 3, Furious 7, and Entourage turned her into a mainstream attraction. Dana White bragged about her movie roles, framing them as proof of her greatness. But insiders saw it differently. While she was on film sets and red carpets, opponents were in the gym, grinding. Critics argued she was distracted, losing the edge that made her terrifying. Instead of fixing her striking, she was chasing fame. Her coach, Edmond Tarverdian, only enabled this, assuring her she didn't need to change. He told her she was already the best. It was a dangerous lie. By the time she fought Holm, the imbalance was glaring. Holm had been sharpening her skills for years, quietly preparing for the moment. Ronda, meanwhile, was stretched thin between film sets and press tours. And when they finally met, it wasn't just Holm's foot that knocked her out. It was years of mismanagement, favoritism, and distraction crashing down at once. Even in defeat, the UFC tried to rewrite the story. They pushed the narrative of a comeback, hyped her return as if nothing had happened. But when Amanda Nunes dismantled her in 48 seconds, the myth was obliterated. The UFC cut ties without ever admitting what really happened. They had built her up too high, too fast, and when she crashed, they abandoned her. And yet, here lies the cruelest irony. For all the UFC's silence, for all the attempts to bury her, Ronda Rousey changed everything. She was the reason Dana White reversed his stance on women's MMA. She was the reason arenas sold out for women's fights. She was the reason little girls across the world saw combat sports as something they could dominate too. Without her, there may never have been an Amanda Nunes, a Valentina Shevchenko, a Rose Namajunas headlining UFC cards. Ronda carried an entire division on her shoulders. She legitimized women's MMA. She opened the doors. But instead of celebrating her as a trailblazer, the UFC minimized her. They chose to let her fade quietly, as if her legacy was too messy to remember. And that is the tragedy. Ronda Rousey should have been immortalized as the pioneer who changed the fight game forever. Instead, her story was treated as an embarrassment, carefully erased from the official narrative. The truth they didn't want you to know is that the UFC owes her everything. Every dollar earned from women's MMA, every superstar who followed, every headline and record-breaking fight, they all trace back to her. Yet when she was broken, when she could no longer carry the weight of their myth, she was left behind. Ronda's legacy is complicated. She was arrogant at times. She refused to shake hands. She bristled at criticism. Her striking never evolved. Her coach failed her. But she was also a trailblazer, a pioneer, a woman who made the impossible possible, a fighter who changed the sport forever. And no matter how hard the UFC tries to bury it, that truth cannot be erased. Ronda Rousey didn't just break arms, she broke barriers. She didn't just headline fights, she headlined history. And even if the UFC wants her remembered as a forgotten chapter, the reality is far greater. She was the myth they created, the star they exploited, and the casualty they buried. But more importantly, she was the trailblazer who paved the way for everything that came after. And that is the truth the UFC never wanted you to know. Thank you for watching. If you found this deep dive into Ronda Rousey's rise and fall eye-opening, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. And if you want to hear more untold stories from the fight game, check out the videos on your screen right now.